right, welcome everybody. I'm Philip J. Watt. This is Dissect Media, and I have the extreme pleasure of providing an interview with Ellen Brown once again. I've interviewed Ellen a couple of times before. She's one of my favourite guests on the podcast because one of my most passionate aspects of my activism or my service is to really bring out the issue around money and banking. It is so integral to our society in terms of how it's operationalised as well as how it's controlled. And we have been within a private banking and a centralisation of money and banking for a long, long time. And it used to be the opposite. We used to have public banking. We used to have a system where the money and banking system was designed to enrich the people, the communities, not designed to enrich those in the private market who have control over the money supply and banking. So it's a big, big issue that we need to move forward and together, both on the left and right. This is an issue that the right really needs to start considering a lot more. And I know the left have got their issues and whatnot, but ultimately the narrative is changing. The narrative is changing is that we can have monetary sovereignty in terms of each nation has a sovereign money supply. And the narrative is also changing in the fact that with too much private and not enough public, we get corporatism. And with too much public and not enough private, we get communism. So just like in life in general, we've got to have a balance in our lives in terms of how playful and how serious we are, or whatever it may be. Our social system needs a balance as well. That's where the narrative is. We are rising above this left and right split on many, many different levels and realising there's some good on the right and some good on the left, and the rest of it's just all bullshit. We need to chuck it out. So that's where we are right now, and Ellen Brown is the go-to woman, the go-to person when it comes to public banking. She wrote the Public Bank Solution in 2013. She wrote The Web of Debt, I think about 3 or 4 years earlier than that. She's written a book way back in the day on forbidden medicine, which I'm interested in to touch on a little bit later. But Ellen has really laid out great plans and and just the theory and the ideas around what public banking means and how we might be able to implement it into our future. So welcome back to the podcast, Ellen. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Phil.
So let's start off with something. Let's just go straight to the core. This interview is going to be seen by a lot of Australians who don't really understand this stuff. And so what I want to do is start off with, what is money? Who creates it? Is it created out of nothing, as the Bank of England said in 2014 in their paper? And we'll go from there.
Right. According to the Bank of England in 2014, 97% of the UK money supply, and it's probably about 95% of the circulating money supply in the US, is created by banks when they make loans. So the Bank of England said, contrary to popular belief, banks are not merely intermediaries that lend money out or that take in money as deposits and then lend it out again. They actually create money in the process of making loans. The problem is, as I see it, is that the bank creates the principal, but it doesn't create the interest. So money is created as a loan, it's paid off, or it's extinguished when the loan is paid off. But the interest is not created in the original loan, so it has to be acquired somewhere, typically by more debt. Somebody somewhere has to go into debt. So that works fine as long as you can keep building this big debt bubble. But at some point, everybody's in debt, which is where we are now pretty much. Governments, businesses, individuals, everybody, all those debt levels are higher than they've ever been. With credit card debt in the U.S. is higher than it's ever been. Car debt, auto debt's higher than it's ever been. Government debt, obviously everywhere, is higher than it's ever been. So if everybody's in debt, who are they in debt to? Obviously to the banks that created this money. And the banks basically get off scot-free. The governments see it as their duty to make sure that the banks can collect, including the interest, because they're also interlocked, that if you let them go down, then everybody goes down, the government goes down. So it's a bad model that we have propped up from various ways, but what we really need to do is redo the model, it seems to me.
And that really just comes down to policy, isn't it? So what I might do is I'll just reiterate for those listening. When you get a mortgage or a credit card debt or get a loan, that money is new money out of nowhere. It wasn't transferred from another account. They just punch numbers into a accounting spreadsheet on a computer, essentially. Most of the money supply is just digital numbers on a bloody spreadsheet. When you pay that money back, that money gets wiped again. So that money no longer exists, but guess who gets to keep the interest? Well, the people, the organisations who created the money out of nothing. Now, this is the question. Why are private, centralised banking cartels, both on an international scale and also within Australia, for example, in Australia, the big four are mostly owned by foreign shareholders and foreign stakeholders and the foreign banks. So most of this interest that comes out of money, creating money out of nothing, nicks off overseas. So why do we not have public banking models like we used to? And this is where we're going to get to with Ellen on this next question. The Commonwealth Bank of Australia used to be a public central bank and a public commercial bank, and it was taken back over the years. But it was originally run by Dennis and Miller and created for the purpose of funding many, many great things. So why do we have private banking instead of or at least we need a competitive model when it comes to public and private banking, as I spoke before. We need that balance. So, Ellen, can you explain what the Commonwealth Bank of Australia used to be, how it used to run, and how we might be able to use that model in our current day and age?
Right. So it was created a bit before the Federal Reserve in 1912 was way ahead of it. I think you mentioned an earlier date. So anyway, and Dennis and Miller was the governor of the bank. The bankers were careful to appoint a banker because they wanted to make sure that they kept control of the system. But when the banks went to Dennis and Miller and said, well, you'll need to borrow from us to capitalize your bank and for liquidity, because he was a banker and he knew how banking works and he knew that banks just create the money they lend, he said, no, I think we'll just create the money on our books. And he did, and financed all sorts of businesses, rebuilt the country, the different infrastructure across the country, and funded Australia's participation in World War I. The mistake he made was to go to the City of London after World War I and brag about being able to fund all these things without being dependent on loans from abroad, or from England specifically. And that was not the purpose. From their point of view, they were attempting to recapture the colonies through debt that they had lost through, revolutions everywhere. So Dennis and Miller died suddenly after that, rather suspiciously, although I haven't really seen any conspiracy theories about it, but it looked a bit suspicious to me. And then the Bank of England came in with this new model where it would be controlled by a board instead of one governor, and they basically took control. So after that, the whole central banking model came up after that, where the Bank of England was supposed to be the head of this pyramid, and the other central banks would be under it, and they would borrow from the Bank of England. But after World War I, the Bank of England England itself was a bit impoverished, and so they spread it out and moved into the Bank for International Settlements in Switzerland. And then we have the whole history of the BIS from there. And in the 1970s, there was the Basel Committee, which basically the theory was that we had, at that point, we had stagflation, where prices were going up, but productivity wasn't. And so this was blamed on governments printing the money. But in fact, that wasn't really what it was. It was really cost-push inflation, including largely from the cost of oil, which quadrupled. Well, it's a long story, but I've written all that. But anyway, so they imposed this new rule where governments were not supposed to borrow from their own central bank, or not, issue money directly or issue it by borrowing it directly. but that they were supposed to borrow on the open market, which meant they had to sell their bonds through the banks. So the banks got their cut, and now you have this separation between even the central bank and the government. So even though they're supposedly one entity, they're really not. And the central bank doesn't just hand the money over to the government, as it would if it were what used to be called a national bank. It lends the money to the government, or it either lends or sells the money to banks. That's where most of Federal Reserve reserves go, which is the new money and the money that's newly created. And it stays on the reserve. Well, that gets a bit complicated again. But anyway, that's where our system came from. And it's not governments issuing the money, but it should be. The American colonists issued the money directly. It was a brilliant new model in their day and allowed them to be very productive in a wilderness. And people were amazed at how well the colonies did. And Australia, of course, did very well originally with that system. Abraham Lincoln just issued the money for the Civil War and built the Continental Railroad, which actually turned a big profit for the government at the same time, and it did not create inflation, and connected both ends of the country together. You know, it's just an amazing piece of infrastructure. So we need to do that as well. We need all kinds of infrastructure. We could just issue the money and build it, and I would argue it would pay for itself in the same way, but you know, it's hard to persuade politicians of that.
Well, it shouldn't be hard to persuade politicians because they're meant to be enacting on the will and the needs and the interests of the people, not on big banks, not on big monopolies, not on big money. So if we don't have politicians who are prepared to have a proper discourse about these issues, then what have we got them elected there in the first place? Plain and simple. Now, basically what you've just described there is the Reserve Bank of Australia is not a part of it's not a national central bank as the Commonwealth Bank of Australia used to be. And they say it's part of the Australian government infrastructure, but there's this intermediate thing where there's a cut being taken from the creation of money by the private banking market. So if we remove that little bit, then we can create the Reserve Bank of Australia would more or less be a national public central bank, as it bloody well should be, and then basically the government is just loaning money to itself. Is that the sort of the picture that you're trying to create there?
Right. And in fact, if you issue money to yourself and it's interest free and you never collect on it, if you can keep rolling it over indefinitely, which is what happens with the federal debt. We have a $22 trillion federal debt. There is absolutely no way that this debt is ever going to get paid off. What gets paid year after year is the interest. And at the rate we're going, it is thought that we'll be paying $1 trillion annually just in interest. In a decade, we'll be paying $1 trillion annually on our federal debt just in interest. So you could eliminate the interest by lending directly from your central bank. And that's what Japan has done. The Bank of Japan now owns 40% of the government's debt, and they're very proud of that. And it's working fine. They still only have a very low inflation rate that did not cause inflation, although there's no logical reason why it should. So the interest goes back to the government then. That's the way our system works too, that the Federal Reserve rebates its profits to the government after deducting its costs. So we could do that, and then just keep rolling over the actual principle. But what they do, they allege, what they did with quantitative easing was that they said that this was an emergency measure. And so the theory was that they would sell the debt back to the market when they were trying to normalize the market, which is what they're doing or did up till just recently. They've stopped selling it back into the market because it turned out to be a disaster, as many people predicted, including me. I mean, they were raising interest rates and selling selling debt into the market. So by selling debt back, they are shrinking the money supply because they are pulling money out and the debt goes into the debt holders, to the bondholders. And by raising interest rates, that was supposed to also shrink the money supply. But we have no need for shrinking the money supply. They're still struggling to try to hit their 2% inflation rate. So you shrink the money supply by driving interest rates up. Of course, you're going to make borrowing more expensive, which has put businesses, particularly, that's the one they were really worried about, that the businesses are right at peak debt. I mean, they're ready to topple over, which could drive us right into another recession or depression like we had 10 years ago.
It's almost like the central banking cartels, or whoever these money makers have been over the years, it's almost like they've checkmated themselves, because they've created a system where money is literally created out of nothing, and we're like, well, why are you in control of this system where money is created out of nothing? Why isn't this system in the hands of the public so that it cares for the needs and the services of the community, not you and your multi-trillion-dollar bloody mates and all the rest of what your system is? Why aren't we doing this for ourselves? So yes, we're in a situation right now where there is a lot of debt owed to the private market, including by the governments. It has been exposed that government bonds are more or less a subtle form of corporate welfare, and that needs to go, absolutely. So there needs to be a process essentially where the government, if we want to do this smoothly essentially, because we're going this way, are we going to go this way via collapse, or are we going to go this way via a smooth transition? There is a lot of private debt that is owed to these banking and other just general enterprises, private enterprises and whatnot, and your local grandma who is invested in government bonds or whatever it may be. And so to do that, I guess we need to stop issuing private debt to the private market, for starters, from a government point of view. And then we need to start generating money through public banking infrastructure. Now, we could do that through just a national public bank and create this currency that way. Or, which I think is a better approach, and I know that you've written about this, Ellen, a lot, that we need to create local public banking networks, because if we do it, then the creation of that money is locally managed, and therefore we have a decentralized system. So it actually meets the needs of some of a lot of people within the Truth and Freedom Network who are over the government control over the minds and the behaviour of the people. They want individual freedom and localization at the forefront of this discussion. And a way to ensure that individual freedom is met is by putting the power back in the hands of the communities through not just local public banking networks, but also localized food and resource systems, including doing it properly to care for the environment, such as polycultural models, such as permaculture, as well as hemp, and basically creating safe, environmentally friendly products, plastics, fuels, energy, building materials, a whole ton of stuff using plants such as hemp. An amazing, amazing resource. But I know I'm going off track. I just wanted to chuck that in there because it's so important to me, Ellen. Local public banking networks and a decentralized system. Do you think, the right way to go about this?
Yes. And, money reformers have been talking about this for probably 100 years, but the banks have just denied it. And it was very hard to break through into the major media. Social creditors have been talking about it since before 1920. But the Bank of England, I think, was kind of forced into acknowledging that that's how money was created it has come up more and more. I mean, like I wrote Web of Debt actually in 2007, not that I claim credit, but Positive Money in England has done a great job they've had actual hearings right in Parliament on where money comes from, and we've all gotten videos out there, and it's just people are so much more aware now, plus the fact that we had this big collapse in 2008, so nobody trusts the government or the central bank anymore, whereas it used to be kind of the temple of the Fed, and now everybody's very skeptical, so we're now peering into it and seeing what's going on, but it is very complicated. My last article that I wrote, I went into the repo market and how that crashed. The 2008 economy, and I got some pushback that it was too wonky. But it's so complicated. I mean, you can't do it in you just can't do it in a 4-page article. It's really got to be in a book where you go step by step by step.
Yes, so the scam has been exposed, Ellen, right? It's all out on the table where the sunlight is providing the disinfectant that our system needs. We have exposed the scam. Money in banking has been stolen from us. It is created out of nothing. I know a lot of people on the right want to go back to a gold standard or some sort of precious metal standard. I believe that's just another faith-based system in and of itself. All money, in fact, is a faith-based system. Why should we go back to a metal standard which has a limiting capacity in terms of how we operationalise our money and banking system? That does not make sense to me. I certainly am on board for decentralised blockchain technologies or other technologies that do, such as some cryptocurrency markets. They could be incorporated into this system somehow, especially the blockchain decentralised technology. That's a fantastic approach. But I certainly don't want to go back to a gold standard. I don't see the value in that. So I'll get your thoughts on that, but also in what ways has local public banking been implemented right now in our current day and age? Are there any good examples that we might be able to go to understand how effective and valuable it is for our communities?